Dr. Mara Silvera had been reviewing intake files for 11 years when her coordinator placed a new folder on her desk at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. The folder was green, the color her clinic used for referrals from outside the county. She picked it up the way she picked up every file, without ceremony, without expectation, reading the patient name first, then the referring physician, then the diagnosis summary. She was 3 lines in before she registered what she was reading. The patient's name was Christina Vidal Ferreira. The emergency contact listed a husband. His name was Daniel Ferreira. She knew that name. She had grown up in the same house as that name. She had watched that name open her acceptance letter to Greenfield Medical School, read it aloud to her parents, and laugh. She set the folder down on her desk. She did not call anyone. She did not move for approximately 40 seconds. Then she picked the folder back up, finished reading the intake summary, and noted that Christina Ferreira, age 33, had been referred to Clover Ridge Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. Her clinic, the clinic she had founded and funded and built from a floor plan on a legal pad, for a comprehensive fertility evaluation following 18 months of failed conception attempts. The referral had been processed by her intake coordinator, Yolanda Baxter, who had no way of knowing that the patient's husband had once stood in a kitchen in Sao Paulo and told a 22-year-old girl that her idea of becoming a doctor was embarrassing the family. Dr. Mara Silvera, medical director of Clover Ridge Fertility and Reproductive Medicine, the only board-certified reproductive endocrinologist in a 3-county radius, looked at her calendar. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened it and found the first available appointment slot. I controlled her timeline. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. The people who should have been your foundation sometimes become the very obstacle you have to build yourself over, and if that's happened to you, I want you to know that what comes next in this story is for you. But to understand why that moment meant what it did, why 40 seconds of silence at my own desk felt like the closing of a very long circle, I have to take you back. 23 years back. To a kitchen in Sao Paulo that smelled like coffee and my mother's anxiety, where my brother Daniel stood holding an envelope that had my name on it, and decided that the contents were funnier than they were real. I was 22 years old. I had applied to 6 medical schools on a scholarship application that had taken me 4 months to write. I had written the personal essay 11 times. The final version was 3 pages, single-spaced, and the central argument was that reproductive medicine in underserved communities in Brazil and in Brazilian immigrant populations in the United States was critically underfunded and under-researched, and that I intended to dedicate my clinical career to closing that gap. I was not writing theoretically. My mother had lost 2 pregnancies before me. She had never been given a clear medical explanation for either loss. She had been handed pamphlets and sent home. I was 22 years old, and I had already decided that this was something I was going to change. The acceptance letter from Greenfield Medical School arrived on a Saturday. I was at work. I was waitressing at a Brazilian steakhouse in the Pinheiros district, picking up every shift I could get, and my mother called me on my break to tell me something had arrived from a school in the United States. I asked her not to open it. I said I would be home in 4 hours. When I got home, Daniel had already opened it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with my father. He was 26. He had a degree in civil engineering from a perfectly adequate state university, a girlfriend named Priya who his parents did not yet know about, and an opinion about everything. He held the letter up when I walked in. He was smiling. He said in Portuguese something that translates to, "Mara, they want you to be a baby doctor." My father looked at the letter. He looked at me. He said, "A fertility doctor, who does that?" My mother said nothing. She was standing at the stove. Daniel said, "It's expensive." Greenfield, I looked it up. $212,000 for 4 years before living expenses. Where does she think she's getting that? I said, "There's a scholarship attached." He picked up the second page. He looked at it. The scholarship was for $40,000 over 4 years. He laughed, not meanly, which was almost worse, but the way you laugh at something that is simply not serious. He put the page down and said, "Mara, be realistic. You'll work yourself to death for 9 years and come out the other side delivering babies for people who can afford it. This is a fantasy." My father nodded. My father almost always nodded when Daniel spoke. I said, "It's reproductive endocrinology." "It's not delivering babies." Daniel said, "Same thing." It was not the same thing. I knew it was not the same thing. I had been reading about it for 3 years. But this was not a conversation where being right about the facts was going to help me. The practical reality, which they were not wrong about, was that the scholarship covered $40,000. Greenfield Medical School was going to cost $212,000. The difference was $172,000, and I had a savings account that held $8,400 and a waitressing job that paid me enough to eat. My parents had money, not wealthy money, but real money, the money of two people who had worked very carefully for 30 years. My father had a retirement account. They had equity in the house. My mother had a small investment property in Kosha that she rented to a young couple for income. Daniel said at some point in that conversation, I don't remember exactly when, but it was after my mother had sat down and my father had poured coffee, even if she gets in, what does she actually do with it? She's not the type. I said, what type am I? He said, the type who finishes. That was the sentence. That was the one, not the laughing, not the money conversation, that one. I went to my room. I got out a piece of paper. I wrote down the name of the program at Greenfield, the name of the department, and the name of the department head, whose research I had been reading for 2 years, a woman named Dr. Patricia O. Simensa, who had published a landmark study on unexplained recurrent pregnancy loss in women of African and Latina descent. I folded the paper. I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I did not argue with Daniel again that night. I had made a decision, not a dramatic one, not one I announced, just a quiet internal realignment. I was not going to convince anyone. I was going to build something. When it was finished, they would be able to see it. That was going to have to be enough. I contacted Greenfield's financial aid office the following Monday. I asked about supplemental funding. They told me about a loan program, a work-study option, and a research assistantship that paid $12,000 a year and came with a tuition reduction of 18%. I wrote all of it down. I ran the numbers on a legal pad at the steakhouse on my break. The gap was still enormous. The gap was real. But it was a number now, not a laugh. I could work with a number. The first year I did not get in. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes assume this story was easy. It was not easy. My first application to Greenfield's MD program, the one my brother had laughed at, was deferred and then rejected in the final round. I got the rejection email on a Thursday evening in March. I was 23 years old, I was still waitressing, and I had spent the previous 7 months volunteering 12 hours a week at a women's health clinic in MoMA specifically to strengthen the application. I sat with the email for about 2 minutes. Then I forwarded it to myself with a note in the subject line that said, "Not yet." I filed it in a folder I had labeled with the word I used instead of rejection, which was the Portuguese word, provisorio, provisional. Nothing is finished until you decide it is finished. The near miss was not just emotional. It was financial. I had taken out a small personal loan, $4,200, to cover the application fees, credential evaluation, and English proficiency testing required for the international application process. When the rejection came, I owed that money with nothing to show for it, and I had also passed up a promotion at the steakhouse to a floor manager position because I had been certain I would be leaving for school. I was not leaving for school. I was staying. And I was now junior to a man named Rodrigo who was 20 years old and had never once taken a table's order without getting something wrong. I reapplied 8 months later. I rewrote the personal essay. I got a letter of recommendation from the director of the MoMA clinic, a physician named Dr. Augusto Carvalho Mendes, who had let me shadow him in the reproductive health consultations on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and who had, at some point in the second month, told me with what I recognized as genuine surprise that I asked better follow-up questions than his first-year residents. He wrote the letter without my having to ask twice. He also, without telling me he was doing it, called a colleague at Greenfield's admissions office and spent 20 minutes on the phone describing what he had observed. I did not know about the phone call until 4 years later, when he told me at my graduation. The acceptance came on a Wednesday. I was alone in my apartment. I had moved out of my parents' house by then, into a 2-room flat in Vila Madalena that I shared with a friend from the steakhouse, a woman named Fernanda who was studying nursing and who kept our kitchen aggressively organized. I opened the email on my phone. I read it twice. I called Fernanda. She screamed. I did not scream. I sat on the floor of our kitchen for a while, then I called my mother. My mother cried. She said she was proud of me. She said she had always known. I believed her about the proud. I was less certain about the always known. I did not call Daniel. He called me eventually about a week later after my mother had told him. He said, "I heard you got in." I said yes. He said, "The money situation is figured out." I said I was taking out loans and I had an assistantship. He said, "Loans, okay." There was a pause. He said, "Be careful with that. That's a lot of debt for a specialty that may not pay what you think it pays." I said thank you. I got off the phone. I had already looked up what reproductive endocrinologists earned. I had a spreadsheet. I did not share the spreadsheet with Daniel. The first RPM keyword I ever encountered professionally was at Greenfield, in a first-year administrative seminar, when a representative from the Student Health Office explained that our health insurance coverage through the university was comprehensive for preventive care, but had specific exclusions for elective procedures, and that we should all read our insurance policy carefully before assuming anything was covered. I wrote it down, not because it was interesting, but because I was already thinking about how my future patients would navigate that exact conversation, and how different the outcome of a specialist appointment could be depending on whether someone understood what their coverage actually said. I wrote it down in the margin of my notebook. Coverage language determines access. Learn the language. I had no idea how much of my career that one sentence would shape. Greenfield Medical School sat on the edge of the Allegheny foothills in western Pennsylvania. It was colder than anything I had grown up with. The campus was red brick, an old-growth oak and winters that lasted until April, and I was one of 4 Brazilian students in my cohort and the only one in the reproductive endocrinology research track. My first year I slept 6 hours a night, and considered that adequate. My second year I slept 5, and considered that better because I was getting more done. The research assistantship placed me in the lab of Dr. Renata Chowdhury, an associate professor of reproductive biology who had trained in Mumbai, done her postdoctoral work in London, and arrived at Greenfield with a research focus on endometrial receptivity in women with recurrent implantation failure. She was 41 years old when I met her, precise in a way that I came to understand was not personality but methodology. She was precise about everything because she had learned early that imprecision in her field cost people years of their lives. Years they spent trying. Years they spent losing pregnancies. Years of grief that looked, from the outside, like nothing visible at all. She assigned me to literature reviews for the first 3 months. Then she had me analyze a subset of her existing dataset. Then in the 5th month she handed me a draft of a paper she was preparing for submission to the Journal of Reproductive Medicine and said, "Read this for logic, not for science. Tell me where the argument loses you." I read it, I told her. She looked at my notes for a very long time, then she said, "You're going to be good at this." I said, "I hope so." She said, "I'm not hoping, I'm observing." That was the beginning of something. I did not know how large yet. In my 3rd year at Greenfield, I was named a research fellow in Dr. Chowdhury's endometrial receptivity program, a designation that came with a small stipend increase, a co-authorship credit on a paper that was accepted by the Journal of Reproductive Medicine in November of my 3rd year, and more importantly, a change in how the department saw me. I was no longer a student who was doing well. I was a researcher who was producing. The distinction mattered in ways I was still learning to read. Dr. Chowdhury had a practice of inviting her fellows to a dinner at the end of each academic year. It was always at her house, always on the last Friday of May, always the same menu: lentil dal, roasted cauliflower, rice, a bottle of Riesling she bought specifically for the occasion. In my 3rd year, the other fellow at the dinner was a man named Marcus Osei, who was finishing his residency and would go on to become one of the best minimally invasive reproductive surgeons I had ever watched work. He would later be one of the first people I called when I started designing the surgical protocols for Clover Ridge. At that dinner, Dr. Chowdhury said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The most important thing a clinician can build in this specialty is not skill. Skill is the baseline. What separates careers is the capacity to hold a patient's hope without becoming its hostage." Marcus asked what that meant practically. She said, "It means you do the work without the work being about you. The outcome is always about them." I did not say anything, but I wrote it down in the Notes app on my phone when I got home, and I have read it before every board exam, every grant application, and every difficult patient conversation I have ever had. There was a moment, in my 4th year of medical school, when I could have told my family what I was building. My mother visited, she came with my aunt, a trip she had been planning for 2 years, and I showed her the campus and took her to lunch at a restaurant near the college, and she held my hands across the table and looked at me with an expression I did not fully know how to receive. She said, "Are you happy here?" I said yes, which was true, though not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated and also less available in that moment because Dr. Chowdhury and I were in the middle of a grant application deadline and I had not slept properly in 11 days. My mother said, "Daniel asks about you." I said, "Does he?" She said, "He wants to know how it's going." I said, "It's going fine." She looked at me for a moment. She knew there was more, she did not push. She was the one person in my family who understood that I would tell things when I was ready to tell them, and that pushing before then had never once produced useful results. I did not tell her about the paper. I did not tell her about the fellowship. I did not tell her about the conversation Dr. Chowdhury had had with two colleagues at Allegheny Regional Medical Center about a promising student she wanted placed in their reproductive endocrinology residency program the following year. She had no idea what I was becoming. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The residency at Allegheny Regional lasted 4 years. I arrived in July of the first year as one of 3 residents in the reproductive endocrinology and infertility track, and I left 4 years later as the only one who had completed a simultaneous research certification in clinical embryology. The program director was a physician named Dr. Solomon Reinhold, a 60-year-old man with a 20-year record of training some of the most technically precise reproductive endocrinologists in the Northeast Corridor, and a habit of standing in the corner of the procedure room with his arms crossed and saying nothing until after the procedure was done, and then offering exactly one piece of feedback, always specific, always the most important thing. The first time he watched me perform an embryo transfer, my 14th, which I had been preparing for by reviewing the technical literature on catheter positioning and endometrial pressure dynamics for 3 weeks prior, he stood in the corner for the entire procedure. When it was finished, and the patient had been moved to recovery, he said, "Your left hand is correcting for something your right hand doesn't know it's doing yet. When you figure out what, come tell me." It took me 6 weeks. I came back and told him it was a tension response in my shoulder, a compensatory movement I had developed during my first procedures when I was managing anxiety through muscle engagement. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Good, now you know, now fix it." I fixed it. By the second year of residency, I was performing the highest volume caseload in my cohort, not because I was the fastest, but because Dr. Reinhold had begun routing complex cases in my direction. Women with prior IVF failure, women with structural anomalies requiring modified protocols, women whose medical records documented years of inconclusive specialist appointments with no clear path forward. I learned to read those files the way Dr. Chowdhury had taught me to read scientific papers, looking for the place where the argument lost the reader, where the clinical logic broke down, where someone had assumed rather than confirmed. I found errors. Not dramatic ones, not negligence, not misconduct, but the quiet errors of a system that was stretched too thin, a medication dosage that had not been adjusted for body weight, a protocol that had not accounted for a prior surgical history documented elsewhere in the medical records, a patient whose health insurance coverage had not been verified before a procedure was scheduled, creating a billing problem that delayed her cycle by 60 days. 60 days. I wrote a note in her chart about the insurance policy verification gap. I flagged it to the practice manager. I followed up. Dr. Reinhold noticed. He said, "You see the system, not just the patient." I said, "You can't fully help the patient without seeing the system." He said, "Most people don't figure that out until they've been practicing for 10 years. I was 28. In the third year of residency, I applied for a small research grant from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, $9,800, for a study on protocol personalization in women with 2 or more failed IVF cycles. The application was rejected in the first round. I revised it. It was rejected again. I revised it a second time, consulted with a biostatistician named Dr. Yuki Hashimoto at the university's research office who helped me reconstruct the methodology section, and resubmitted. It was funded in the fourth round. The amount was $9,800. I treated that amount like it was 980,000. The study ran for 14 months. The preliminary results were presented at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine annual conference in October of my final year of residency. The day I got on the plane to fly to the conference, Daniel texted me. He had no idea where I was going. He texted to ask if I was coming home for Christmas. I said probably not, I had a work commitment. He said, still at the hospital? I said yes. He said, okay, let us know. That was the full extent of his understanding of where I was, at a hospital, somewhere, still doing the thing he had not expected me to finish. I turned off my phone and flew to the conference. I presented in a breakout session attended by 112 clinicians and researchers. A physician from Stanford asked 3 follow-up questions that were the most technically sophisticated questions I had ever been asked in a public setting. I answered all 3. After the session, she found me at the coffee station and gave me her card. Her name was Dr. Amara Akaffer. She was a senior research fellow at Stanford's Reproductive Sciences Division. She said, "Your methodology on the endometrial assessment subgroup is the most elegant thing in this session. Are you staying in academics or going clinical?" I said, "Both if I can manage it." She said, "You can manage it, call me when you decide what you want to build." I held her card for the rest of the conference. I had been thinking about what I wanted to build for 3 years. I had a floor plan. I had a spreadsheet. I had a name. The year after residency, I completed a fellowship in clinical embryology and advanced reproductive surgery at Hartwell University Medical Center in Maryland. It was 18 months. By the end of the fellowship, I had performed or directly supervised 431 embryo transfer procedures, developed a modified stimulation protocol for poor responders that the department adopted as standard practice, and been offered a full attending position in Hartwell's reproductive endocrinology division with a salary of $206,000 annually. I thanked them. I declined. I consulted with a financial advisor named Thomas Eck at Meridian Capital Planning in Baltimore. I showed him the spreadsheet. He looked at it for a long time. He asked about my retirement savings. I had been contributing to a tax-deferred account since my first year of residency, and about the equity situation on a small property I had purchased in my 3rd residency year with a cosigner loan. He adjusted 3 figures in his own spreadsheet. He said, "You have enough to begin. Not enough to fail. Do not fail." I said I was not planning to. I hired an attorney named Vivienne Carré at Carré and Solis Legal Group in Bethesda, a healthcare and business formation specialist, to handle the clinic incorporation documents, the regulatory filings, the lease negotiation for the building I had identified in Clover Ridge, Pennsylvania, a small city 22 miles from Allegheny Regional with no existing fertility services within a 60-mile radius. Vivienne reviewed the lease, flagged 3 clauses that would have limited my ability to expand the facility, and renegotiated them out of the contract in a single phone call that I was not on because she told me that my being on the call would make the landlord take longer. The lease was signed on a Thursday in April. I was 33 years old. The clinic opened 14 months later. The name on the door was Clover Ridge Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. The medical director was Dr. Mara Silvera. The staff on opening day was 4 people. Me, my nurse coordinator Yolanda Baxter, an embryologist named Dr. Patrick Nkemdirim who had been my fellow at Hartwell, and a patient services administrator named Grace Ewan, who had run the front office at a large OB/GYN practice in Harrisburg for 9 years, and who knew how to handle insurance billing disputes the way some people know how to handle a bad hand of cards, not with panic, but with strategy. First patient I saw at Clover Ridge was a 31-year-old woman who had been told by 2 other providers that her case was, in a word one of them had actually used, unlikely. She had 1 diminished ovarian reserve, a prior miscarriage, and a medical record that was 3 inches thick and had never been synthesized into a single coherent clinical picture. I spent 90 minutes with her on her first visit. At the end of the appointment, she asked me if I thought there was a real chance. I told her I thought there was a real plan, and that a real plan was the beginning of a real chance. 18 months later, she delivered a daughter. She sent me a photograph. I have it on my desk, next to the folded piece of paper from my wallet, the one I finally unfolded the day the clinic opened, the one with Dr. Patricia O. Simens's name and department and research focus in my 22-year-old handwriting. I kept that paper there because I needed to remember what it felt like to fold it, to decide to wait, to know that the right moment was not yet but was coming. By the end of Clover Ridge's second year of operation, we had completed 47 IVF cycles, with a success rate that placed us in the top quartile of clinics our size nationally. Dr. Nkemdirim had expanded our embryology laboratory to include pre-implantation genetic testing. Grace Ewan had built a billing and insurance verification system that had reduced our denied claims rate to less than 4%. She had done it by creating a standardized intake checklist that cross-referenced each patient's insurance policy against our procedure list before a single appointment was scheduled, catching coverage gaps before they became delays. I had called Dr. Acaffer at Stanford to consult on a particularly complex case involving uterine factor infertility. She had driven up from a conference she was attending in Philadelphia to look at the imaging with me in person. Afterwards, she sat in my office and looked at the clinic through my office window and said, "You built exactly what you said you would." I said, "I had a floor plan." She said, "Everyone has a floor plan. You built the building." My family still did not know the building existed. My mother knew I had started some kind of clinic. She had that much information. She knew I was no longer at Allegheny Regional. She did not know what kind of clinic, or where exactly, or that it was the only program of its kind in 3 counties. Daniel, to my knowledge, knew nothing. He had called once in the previous 18 months, a birthday call, 4 minutes, no questions about my work. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time. There had been a moment, a profile piece in a regional healthcare publication, published in my clinic's 18th month, that ran with a photograph and a headline that included my full name and specialty and the clinic's location, when I had genuinely wondered whether someone in my family would see it. No one called. No one mentioned it, but it wasn't time yet. The green folder arrived 14 months after that article. Yolanda placed it on my desk at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. I read the patient name. I read the emergency contact. I sat for 40 seconds. Then I opened my calendar. Christina Ferreira's first appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday. The appointment type was listed in our system the way all initial consultations were listed. New patient, comprehensive fertility evaluation, insurance verification pending. I noted without particular emphasis that the insurance verification would need to be completed before the appointment. That was standard. Yolanda would handle it. She always did. I set the folder in the active stack. I moved to the next file, but I did not stop thinking about the Thursday appointment. Not because I had decided anything, not because I had a plan yet, just because some things, when they arrive, announce themselves whether you want them to or not. My brother's wife's name in my intake system was not a coincidence I could set aside. It was a door, and I had not yet decided whether to open it or to simply stand on the other side of it and wait for someone to knock. The Thursday appointment came and went without incident, which is to say it went the way every first appointment at Clover Ridge went. 90 minutes, a comprehensive history, a review of all prior medical records, baseline blood work ordered, and a follow-up scheduled for 2 weeks out. Christina Ferreira was 33 years old, soft-spoken, careful with her words in the way that people are careful when they have already been disappointed enough times to have learned not to want too much before the evidence supports wanting. She had a kind face. She was nervous in the particular way that fertility patients are nervous at a first appointment, not afraid of me, but afraid of what I might tell her, which is a different and more specific kind of fear. I treated her the way I treated every patient. I listened. I asked follow-up questions. I did not offer reassurance before I had something real to offer it about. I ordered the blood work and the imaging and the additional records from her previous provider, and I told her we would have a clearer picture at the follow-up. She thanked me. She shook my hand. Daniel was not with her. He had not come to the appointment. This was not unusual. Many partners did not attend first consultations, particularly when the initial referral was for the female partner's evaluation. I noted his absence without judgment. I noted it and filed it and went to my next patient. The follow-up was 2 weeks later. Daniel came to that one. I had thought in the days between about how I was going to handle this. Not from a professional standpoint, that was clear, that was stable. The protocol did not change because the patient's husband was my brother. I had thought about it from a personal standpoint. How I was going to sit across a table from the man who had told me I was not the type who finishes and deliver a clinical assessment of his wife's fertility workup and remain the physician I had built myself to be. I decided, before he walked in, that I was going to be exactly that. Not the younger sister, not the woman who had sat in that kitchen in Sao Paulo and felt something go cold inside her. The physician, the medical director of Clover Ridge Fertility and Reproductive Medicine, the only board-certified reproductive endocrinologist in 3 counties. He walked in, and he saw me, and I watched his face go through 4 distinct stages in approximately 2 seconds. The first was recognition. The second was confusion. The third was a kind of recalibration. I could see it, the internal machinery adjusting, trying to place me in a context that made sense to him. The fourth was something I had not anticipated, which was a smile. Not a warm one, a social one. The kind of smile that people produce when they want to appear as though they were not just surprised. He said, "Mara." I said, "Daniel, please sit down. I'd like to go over Christina's results." He sat. Christina was watching both of us. She knew, from some prior conversation or from whatever Daniel had told her, that this was complicated. She had not mentioned it at the first appointment. I respected that. I went through the results the same way I went through results with every patient couple. I started with what was straightforward. I moved to what required more discussion. I was clear and I was specific, and I did not use softening language that was imprecise. Imprecise language, in a fertility consultation, does not protect patients. It delays their ability to make informed decisions. Christina's results showed diminished ovarian reserve. Her AMH was low for her age. Her antral follicle count was below threshold, and there was a structural finding on imaging that warranted further evaluation. Her situation was not simple. It was not impossible, but it was going to require a personalized protocol and careful monitoring, and the kind of sustained clinical relationship that only worked when the patient trusted the physician completely. When I finished, Daniel said, "So what are the actual chances?" I said, "That depends on several factors we haven't fully characterized yet. The additional imaging will tell us more." He said, "Ballpark." I said, "I don't work in ballparks. I work in individualized assessments. That's why you're here." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Right, okay." Then he said, and this was the sentence, this was the one that confirmed everything I had already understood about what was coming, "I'm glad we found this place. I didn't know you were in this county." I said, "I've been here for 3 years." He said, "You should have said something." I kept my expression neutral. I kept my hands flat on the folder in front of me. I said, "You have my number." He said nothing to that. Christina looked out the window. I scheduled the additional imaging and the follow-up and walked them to Yolanda's desk. Daniel turned at the door and said, "Listen, when you have a chance, maybe we could get dinner." Catch up? His tone was the tone of someone extending a reasonable social invitation, which is to say it contained no acknowledgement that there was any history in the room requiring acknowledgement. I said, "Let's focus on Christina's care first." He nodded. He left. I went back to my office. I sat down. I looked at the photograph on my desk, the patient who had delivered the daughter, the photograph I had placed next to the folded piece of paper. I looked at both of them for a moment. Then I picked up the phone and called Vivienne Carré at Carré and Soli's legal group. I told her I needed to review my clinic's conflict of interest documentation. I told her I had a patient situation that I was managing appropriately and that I wanted to ensure my protocols were fully documented. She said she would clear time the following morning. I said thank you. I hung up. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out a legal pad. I started writing. Not notes, I was not writing a letter, I was not drafting anything formal. I was writing the sequence of events as I understood them, in order with specific dates and names and conversations, the way Dr. Chowdhury had taught me to document anything that might later require a clear account. I wrote for 40 minutes. When I was finished, I signed and dated the bottom of each page. That evening, I called Vivienne Carré again. Not about the conflict of interest documentation. About something else. Something I had been thinking about for longer than I wanted to admit, something that had been sitting at the edge of my awareness since the green folder had arrived, and that had moved to the center of it when Daniel had sat in my consultation room and smiled that social smile and said I should have said something. I told her what I needed. She listened without interrupting. When I was finished, she said, "This is manageable. I'll need 3 things from you. I'll send you the list tonight." I said, "Send it." She sent it at 10:47 that evening. I read it. I started on the first item before midnight. I signed the first document at 12:23 in the morning, standing at my kitchen counter in my apartment above the clinic, in the specific quiet that comes only after a decision that cannot be undone. There was no going back. The three things Vivienne needed from me were, in order, a complete financial disclosure of my clinic's assets and operational accounts since founding, a copy of the original lease agreement and all subsequent amendments, and a formal written account of any professional interactions I had had or anticipated having with the patient in question, including all dates and the clinical basis for each decision. I had the financial disclosure prepared within 48 hours. Thomas Eck at Meridian Capital Planning pulled the figures, the clinic's operational revenue, the outstanding equipment financing, the property lease value, the retirement savings account I had maintained since residency, the equity position on the Clover Ridge building, which I had purchased from my landlord in year 2 when he had offered me a right of first refusal and Vivienne had advised me to take it. Thomas organized everything into a single document. He sent it to Vivienne. She called me the same day and said, "Your financial position is stronger than you described it to me." I said, "I described it accurately." She said, "You undersold it, which is fine. I'm telling you so you understand what you're working with." I understood. I had always understood. I had just learned, early and thoroughly, not to announce what I had before the moment required it. The lease documents and amendments went to Vivienne the following morning. The written clinical account I had already prepared. It was the legal pad from the evening Daniel had walked out of my clinic, signed and dated, each page sequential. Vivienne called me 3 days later. She said, "I want to walk through something with you. I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing and I want you to correct anything I have wrong." She walked through it. I corrected nothing. She said, "You understand that if you proceed, this becomes a matter of record." I said, "That's the point." She said, "Some people, when it becomes a matter of record, find it more complicated than they expected. The legal process has a way of surfacing things that feel manageable privately but feel different publicly." I said, "Vivienne, I have been managing this privately for 23 years. I am finished managing it privately." There was a pause. She said, "Okay. Then let's talk about the trust documents." The trust documents were something I had established 3 years prior, when I had incorporated the clinic and structured its ownership through a legal framework that Vivienne had designed. At the time, the structure had been about liability protection and estate planning, standard for a physician-owned practice. What it also meant, as Vivienne now explained in the context of what I was preparing, was that the clinic's ownership was fully documented, legally protected, and not subject to any claim that could arise from family relationship or informal expectation. I said, "So there's no ambiguity about what I own?" She said, "None," I said, "and the documentation on that is complete and filed." She said, "Completely. The trust documents are registered. The financial disclosure supports them. Your equity position is clear." I said, "Good." She said, "There is one more thing, the conflict of interest question, the patient relationship. You need to make a clinical decision before we move forward on the other matter. The two cannot run simultaneously without a formal notation in your clinic's records." I had already made the clinical decision. I had made it the night the green folder arrived, in the 40 seconds of silence before I opened my calendar. I was going to refer Christina Ferreira to a colleague for ongoing care. Not because I could not treat her, I could treat her, I was the best person in 3 counties to treat her, but because the situation required a separation that was cleaner than what I could provide while the other matter was in motion. The decision was about her, not about me. She deserved a physician whose attention was not divided by anything, even something she would never see. The colleague I had in mind was Dr. Marcus Osei, who had completed his fellowship the same year as mine and who had in the intervening years built one of the best reproductive surgery practices in western Pennsylvania. He was 40 minutes away. He was excellent. I called him before I called Vivienne. He answered on the second ring. I explained the clinical picture, AMH levels, antral follicle count, the structural finding, the protocol I had begun designing. He listened. He said, "Send me the records." I said, "I need to tell you something about the patient's situation." He said, "Personal." I said, "Adjacent." He said, "Send me the records, I'll take the case." I said, "Marcus." He said, "Mara, I know. Send me the records." That was the conversation. 5 exchanges total. 12 years of professional relationship had made it that efficient. Christina's medical records were transferred to Dr. Osei's practice with her written consent the following Monday. She called me after she received the transfer documentation. She said, "Can I ask why?" I said, "There's a situation I need to manage that could affect the objectivity of your care. It has nothing to do with your clinical picture or your prognosis. Dr. Osa is excellent, you will be in the best possible hands." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it Daniel?" I said, "Christina." She said, "I knew something was off when he recognized you. He never mentioned you were a doctor." I said, "He might not have known the details." She said, "He knew, he just didn't want to say." Another pause. "I'm sorry. For whatever he did, I've been with him for 6 years and I've been figuring things out slowly." I said, "This is your care. Focus on your care. Dr. Osa will take excellent care of you." She thanked me. She said she hoped things worked out. I believe she meant it. 3 days after the records transfer, Daniel called me. It was a Wednesday evening. He had found out about the referral from Christina or from the transfer documentation and he was not pleased. He said, "Why did you refer her out? That's not, you're supposed to be helping her." I said, "The referral is in her clinical best interest. Dr. Osa is one of the best reproductive surgeons in the region." He said, "You're the best in the region. You just told us that, the only one in 3 counties." I said, "I have a conflict of interest that makes it inappropriate for me to be her treating physician." He said, "What conflict of interest? We're family." I kept my voice even. I said, "That is the conflict." He said, "Mara, come on, this is Christina. This is my wife. I need you to, I'm asking you, as your brother, to help her." I said, "I am helping her. I referred her to the best available colleague. That is the clinical help I can offer right now." There was a pause. His voice changed, not angry but lower, more direct. He said, "What's going on with you? Why are you being like this?" I looked at the legal pad on my desk. I looked at the photograph and the folded paper. I said, "Daniel, I need you to trust that I am making the right professional decision. When you're ready to have a different conversation, not about Christina's care, a different conversation, I'm available." He said, "What different conversation?" I said, "Good night, Daniel." I hung up. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. Within 24 hours of that call, Vivienne had filed the first formal document with the county court. It was not a dramatic filing. It was a petition, specific and procedural, relating to a financial matter that had been unresolved for 23 years. The matter was this. When I had left for Greenfield Medical School, my parents had established a small educational support fund, $12,000, drawn from the equity in the Kosha property that had been verbally designated for my medical education. It had never been formally documented. It had never been transferred to me. It had been absorbed, over the subsequent decade, into the family's general financial picture. My mother had mentioned it once, 7 years ago, in a phone call, in a tone that suggested she assumed I knew what had happened to it. I had said nothing. I had written down the amount and the date and put it in the folder I kept at the back of my filing cabinet at home, the folder I had labeled with a word I used instead of injustice, which was the Portuguese word, pendent, pending. $12,000. Not a large amount by any measure of what I had built. But it was the amount my parents had set aside, and that had disappeared, and more than the money, it was the documentation of a pattern. Vivienne had explained that the petition would require a financial disclosure from my father's estate. My father had passed away 4 years prior, and the estate had been managed since then by Daniel, who had been named executor. Vivienne said, "The estate attorney handling your father's estate will need to produce the financial disclosure. All assets, all distributions, all transfers since the estate was opened." I said, "And the 12,000, she said, "will be documented or it won't. Either way, we'll know." Daniel did not yet know that his management of my father's estate was about to be examined by a court-appointed process that required him to produce every financial disclosure he had made or failed to make in the preceding 4 years. He did not know because I had not told him, and because the filing had been made quietly and procedurally on a Wednesday afternoon, while he was, presumably, somewhere thinking that our phone call the previous evening had been the full extent of what I had in motion. He called once more, 3 days before the formal notification reached him. He called to ask if I was coming to a family gathering, a birthday dinner for our mother, the following Saturday. His tone was normal. Slightly cautious, the way his tone had been slightly cautious since the consultation, but normal. I said, "I'll be there." He said, "Good, it'll be good to catch up properly." I said, "It will." I hung up and called Vivienne. I told her I would be attending a family gathering on Saturday and that I expected the notification would arrive at Daniel's address by Friday at the latest. She said it would. She said, "How are you feeling about it?" I said, "Ready." She said, "Good, call me after Saturday." The notification arrived at Daniel's address on a Thursday. I know this because he called me Thursday evening at 8:47 p.m. and the first thing he said was, "What did you file?" I said, "A petition relating to our father's estate." He said, "You're Mara, you're suing the estate." I said, "I'm petitioning for a financial accounting. That's different from a suit. Vivienne Carré at Carré and Solis can answer your attorney's questions." He said, "Why are you doing this? Why now?" I said, "Because the estate has been open for 4 years and I have not received a single financial disclosure as a named beneficiary under the will." There was a silence. Then he said, "You never asked." I said, "A beneficiary doesn't need to ask. The executor has a legal obligation to provide." Another silence. Longer. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The confidence that had characterized every conversation we had ever had, the confidence that I had grown up watching him deploy in every room he entered, was present, but it had a different quality. It was thinner. He said, "Can we talk about this before Saturday?" I said, "I'll see you Saturday." I was not going to the birthday dinner as an ambush. I want to be clear about that. I was going because it was my mother's birthday, and because I loved my mother, and because the dinner and the petition were not the same event, and I was capable of holding both without conflating them. What I could not control, what I had known I could not control since Vivienne filed the petition, was that Daniel would conflate them, and that the dinner was going to become something that it had not been intended to be. I arrived at my mother's house at 6:15. My mother opened the door. She held my face in both hands the way she had held my face since I was a child, and she said, "Mara," just my name. That was sufficient. The other people at the dinner were my mother's sister, my Aunt Fatima, Fatima's husband, Uncle Renato, Daniel and Christina, a cousin named Paulo who was 28 and largely uninvolved in anything, and a neighbor of my mother's named Mrs. Evangelina Ribeiro who had been coming to family dinners for 15 years and who would, I later reflected, be the most dignified person in the room for the entire evening. Dinner proceeded normally for approximately 40 minutes. My mother had made the food herself, feijoada, rice, farofa, a tomato salad, and she was happy, genuinely happy, the way she was always happy when her children were in the same room. I watched her at the head of the table and I thought about the phone call from Greenfield, the one where she had said she was proud of me and I had believed her. I thought about the visit she had made to Pennsylvania, the lunch, her hands across the table. Dessert had just been served when Daniel said, "We should talk about the petition." My mother looked up from her plate. Fatima looked at Renato. "Mrs. Ribeiro looked at her cake. I said, "This is Mom's birthday dinner." Daniel said, "I know what it is. I'm asking you as a family to explain why you filed a legal petition against our father's estate without saying a word to anyone." I said a word to Vivienne Carré." He said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "I know what you mean. My answer is that the petition is a matter of legal process. The estate has been open for 4 years. I'm a named beneficiary. I'm entitled to a financial disclosure." My mother said quietly, "What financial disclosure?" Daniel said, "It's not, Mom, it's a legal thing." "Mara is," I said, "Mom, Dad's estate included a fund that was set aside for my education. $12,000 drawn from the Kosha property equity. I never received it. I never received a financial accounting of what happened to it. I filed a petition asking for that accounting." My mother looked at Daniel. Daniel said, "That money went to, there were expenses after Dad died. Funeral costs. The estate had obligations." I said, "Which is exactly what a financial disclosure would document." He said, "You didn't need to file a petition, you could have asked me." I said, "Daniel, I am asking you now in front of our family to tell me what the financial disclosure of our father's estate shows." He looked at me. He looked at Christina. Christina was looking at the table. He said, "I don't have those numbers in front of me." I said, "That's fine. Vivienne does." He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I've been waiting for 4 years for a disclosure you were legally required to provide. That's not planning, that's patience." Fatima said, "Daniel, did you provide the accounting?" He said, "There's a process. These things take time." I reached into the bag I had placed beside my chair when I arrived. I took out a folder, not green, this one was white, the color my attorney used for formal correspondence. I placed it on the table next to my plate. I said, "The petition includes the court's request for financial disclosure of all estate assets and distributions since the estate was opened. The response deadline is 30 days. The first document also identifies 3 specific distributions made from the estate account in year 2 that were not reported to the other beneficiaries. That was the first document. I paused. I have 3 more. Daniel's hands, which had been resting on the table with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never, in his life, sat at a table where he did not control the narrative, went still. I watched it happen. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just still. He said, "What are the other 3?" I said, "The second is a formal request for documentation of the Kosha property transfer. The property was listed in Dad's estate. It was sold 18 months after he died. I was not informed of the sale. I did not receive a distribution from the proceeds." My mother said, "The Kosha property was sold." Daniel said, "I told you, Mom, I sent you the paperwork." She said, "You sent me papers, I signed papers, you didn't say it was Kosha." Fatima said, "Renato." Renato said nothing, but he put down his fork. I said, "The third document is a declaration from Thomas Eck at Meridian Capital Planning, who has reviewed the estate's publicly filed tax records and identified a discrepancy between the declared asset value at estate opening and the documented sale price of the Kosha property 14 months later. The discrepancy is $47,000. $47,000. I said it the way I said dollar figures in my clinic, specifically without emphasis, because the specificity was the emphasis. Daniel said, "That's property values change, you know that." I said, "In 14 months in a stable market, they do not typically change by $47,000. Thomas's declaration addresses that in detail." Christina put her hand over her mouth. She was not performing. She had been figuring things out slowly for 6 years, she had told me. She was figuring out something specific right now. My mother said, "What is the fourth document?" The room was completely quiet. Mrs. Ribeiro had stopped even the small peripheral movements, the adjustment of a napkin, the setting down of a glass, that people make when they are trying to disappear politely. I said, "The fourth document is a copy of Dad's will. The original will, which Vivienne obtained through the probate court. I had not previously seen it, the will had not been shared with me when the estate was opened, which is also a procedural obligation of the executor." I looked at Daniel. I said, "Dad's will specifically named me as a co-beneficiary of the Kosha property and of an educational trust of $12,000. Both are documented. Neither was disclosed to me. Both are now before the court." Daniel looked at me for a long time. His face did something complicated. Not collapse, he was not the collapsing type, which was one of the few things I had always respected about him. But the sentence he had been building, I could watch it happen, watch the words assemble and then disassemble. The sentence did not come out. What came out instead was silence. Then he said, "I didn't know the will said that." I said, "The estate attorney had a copy. The probate court had a copy. As executor, you were required to read it in full before filing." The estate attorney Daniel had hired was a man named Gerald Pratt at Pratt & Munoz in Pittsburgh, a general practice firm with no particular specialty in estate law. Vivienne had already contacted Gerald Pratt's office. Gerald Pratt had, it emerged, sent Daniel a summary document rather than the full will. Whether this was negligence or convenience was a question for a different proceeding. What mattered tonight was that the will existed, the court had it, and the provisions it contained were now in front of everyone in the room. My mother said in Portuguese, very quietly, "He set that aside for you." I said, "I know." She said, "He told me he was doing it. He said he wanted you to know he believed in you." I had not known that. I had known the fund existed because she had mentioned it, years ago, in passing. I had not known why my father had established it, or what he had said when he did. I sat with that for a moment. At the table in front of everyone I sat with it. Daniel said, "Mara, I didn't know, I swear to you I didn't know the full will. If I had known," I said, "Daniel." I kept my voice the same, not warm, not cold, level. "The petition is filed. Vivienne will manage the process. If there are distributions owed, they will be calculated and paid through the court. That is the appropriate mechanism. I am not here tonight to punish you. I am here because it is Mom's birthday. Those are 2 separate facts." He said, "It doesn't feel like 2 separate facts." I said, "I know, but it is." My cousin Paulo, who had not said anything for the entire duration of this, and who I would later feel some genuine warmth toward for this, said, "Should I get more cake?" My mother laughed. A short, surprised, exhausted laugh. I laughed too. Fatima laughed. Even Mrs. Ribeiro, who had been perfectly still for 20 minutes, allowed herself a small smile. Daniel did not laugh, but he looked at me, across the table, with an expression I had not seen from him before, not respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that the room he had walked into was not the room he had expected to be in. I had not been planning this moment for 23 years. I want to be precise about that. I had been building something for 23 years. The moment was a consequence of the building, not the purpose of it. The court process took 4 months. Gerald Pratt, at Vivienne's request, produced the full estate documentation. The financial disclosure confirmed 3 distributions from the estate account that had not been formally reported. 2 were legitimate expenses, funeral costs and property tax arrears, that had simply not been documented correctly. The third was a transfer of $11,000 to a personal account that Daniel attributed to estate management fees, that he had not formally contracted for and could not substantiate with documentation. The court found that Daniel had not acted in willful bad faith. The ruling was specific about that. What it found was a pattern of procedural failure in his role as executor. Undocumented decisions, distributions made without formal accounting, and a failure to provide required notifications to co-beneficiaries. The legal settlement required him to repay the $11,000 to the estate, which was then distributed equally between my mother and me. My share of the estate, including the educational trust and my portion of the Kosha property proceeds, came to $31,400. I put it in a dedicated account. I did not spend it on anything immediately. I thought about what my father had said when he set the original $12,000 aside. Said he wanted me to know he believed in me. I already knew, but $31,400 was a specific kind of confirmation. Daniel and I did not speak for 7 months after the birthday dinner. 8 months after he called me, it was a Sunday, he said, "How is the clinic?" I said, "Busy, good. How is Christina?" He said, "Pregnant, 12 weeks, Dr. Osa." I said, "That's wonderful." He said, "Yeah," a pause. "He's good, you were right." I said, "I know." Another pause, longer. He said, "I'm sorry, Mara, for the estate thing, and for the other stuff, the old stuff." I had thought about what I would say when this moment came. I had not known it would come, but I had thought about it anyway, the way you think about the possibility of something you want without being certain you'll receive it. I said, "I know you're sorry, I believe you." I meant both sentences. He said, "You turned out to be exactly what you said you would be." I said, "I told you I was the type who finishes." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I let him have it. "We have not fully repaired things, I want to be honest about that. Repair is not a single conversation. It is a series of smaller ones over time, each one building slightly more load-bearing capacity than the last. We are in the middle of that series. It is slow. Some weeks it does not move at all. But it is moving." Christina delivered in the spring. A boy. She sent me a photograph. She named him Augusto. I do not know whether it was coincidence or something else, but the name of the director of the MoMA clinic who had written my letter of recommendation and called Greenfield and driven 4 hours to tell me at my graduation was Dr. Augusto Carvalho Mendes, and when I saw the name on the birth announcement, I sat with it for a while. I still run Clover Ridge Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. We are in our 6th year. We have completed 214 IVF cycles. Our clinical success rate is in the top decile nationally for clinics of our size. Dr. Nkemdirim runs our embryology laboratory. Grace Ewan runs our operations with a precision that I have stopped trying to improve because it is already optimal. Dr. Ose refers cases to us regularly, and I refer cases to him, and we have a standing monthly call on Thursday mornings that has become, over time, less about clinical consultation and more about the kind of honest professional conversation that is rare enough to be valued. I have a life outside this clinic. I take long walks on Sunday mornings along the Clover Ridge Reservoir. I have a garden that is mediocre but earnest. I have a small group of friends, Fernanda, who still keeps aggressively organized kitchens, now in Philadelphia, where she is a senior nursing director at Jefferson Hospital. Dr. Amara Akafer, who visits twice a year and stays in the guest room and always brings wine that is better than anything I would buy for myself. And a woman named Isabella Costa, who teaches high school biology in the district adjacent to Clover Ridge, and who I met at the reservoir 4 years ago, and who is the most grounded person I have ever known. I have the photograph on my desk. I have the folded piece of paper next to it. I have my father's words, which I did not hear directly, but which reached me through a court document, and through my mother's voice at a birthday dinner where all of it finally became visible. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence is yours in a way that nothing built for an audience will ever be. The work done without witnesses is the foundation that holds when everything else is tested. 2. Documentation is not aggression, it is the language of institutions, and learning to speak it fluently is the single most protective thing a person can do for themselves and for the people they are responsible for. 3. Your family's failure to recognize you is information about them, not a verdict about you, and the sooner you stop waiting for their recognition to begin, the sooner you can build something worth recognizing. Was I wrong to wait 23 years before asking for what I was owed, to build in complete silence instead of fighting for it openly when it would have mattered most? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.